Today, we welcome to the bridge a noted columnist, blogger, and podcaster of issues of geopolitics and economics, whose published works can be found on the Global Times, Sputnik, News India, Xinhua's Global Link, iChongqing's Global Vision, BNN Breaking News, DD Geopolitical Podcast, and more. Welcome to the bridge, S.L. Kanthan.
Thank you so much, Jason. It's my pleasure.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm a big fan of yours, as you know. I like probably all of your posts on X. You post some very fascinating material, a lot of data, a lot of economic insights. I'm absolutely a giant fan of yours. I'm happy to have you on the show.
Thank
We'd
you.
like to,
So I think we both are very similar in that sense because I
yeah,
like all your posts, and your posts are very factual with a lot of charts and graphs and numbers. So we're on
mhm.
the same page.
Yeah. It's really a lot easier to understand the world through data
Uh-oh, I'm having a little bit of trouble hearing you.
than just some.
Okay, so you're sort of breaking it up, Jason.
Oh well, might be. Well, my VPN is off. It should be okay theoretically. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's try. We'd like to learn more about you. You know, I know you've traveled a lot because I've seen pictures of you in LA with Julia Stiles, and you've mentioned an online traveling to a lot of other places. Can you tell us a little bit about your global travels?
Sure. So I guess I have a travel bug. I've been to about 40 countries
40.
in yeah, in the U.S., Latin America, Europe, Africa, uh, Asia. So I've been to rich countries and poor countries. So people ask me, "What is your favorite country?" You know, but I like them all
Mm,
because wherever I go, I have a lot of fun learning about the culture and the people. And if you send me to North Korea next week, I'm sure that I'll have a blast. you know, so the best way to learn, so not just about geopolitics, but in general, the best way to learn in life, I think, is to travel
mm,
because you learn that there are so many ways for, I mean, in life to do things differently and to think differently.
mm,
So you go to a new country, they speak a different language, they dress differently, they have different food, they have different ways of doing things. Whether it's the political system or something. The buildings are different, the streets are different, the furniture is different. And in terms of thinking, I think that's also very important because you
mm,
see how what people value in their life, what life means to them, the family values, the society, patriotism, and the way they solve problems, or even the sense of humor. It can vary from country to country. So that's wonderful. And
mm,
also the history, I think it's, we're looking at all the geopolitical changes that are happening right now.
mhm,
I think the sense of history is very different,
mm,
So, for example, like, well, if you go to Rome, and you see all these beautiful palaces and churches and the Colosseums, and then you wonder what happened to the Roman Empire,
mhm,
you know. And then you look at the U.S. in some sense, it's very much like the Roman Empire
mhm,
in the last stages in terms of wars, the debt, the bread and circuses. So, in some sense, I wish that like more Americans would learn history and they would go to Budapest, to Rome, Istanbul, Xi'an, and then they learned that, hey, this is cycle of history. The
Mm,
empires come and the empires go, and people make the same mistakes over and over,
mm,
which is kind of sad. It's
mhm,
like people don't learn.
mm,
And the thing is that nobody is perfect. So no society is perfect, no country is perfect, but we have to take the best,
mhm,
because I see like in on social media, a lot of people just only focus on the bad things about China.
mm,
Oh, China, we don't have freedom. I cannot say this in China, blah, blah, blah. So I say, well, so take the best, like because there's so much to learn from China. There are so many good things about China. So why don't you just focus on what's good? You learn from that, and then you better yourself, you know.
mhm,
And because especially, the two things that really bother me are one is xenophobia on
mhm,
social media. My God, the things that people say about China, Russia, it's just shocking, because I've been to both Russia and to Ukraine,
mhm,
and I liked both countries. You
mhm,
know, the people in both countries were so wonderful.
mhm,
So, and then I see on social media, people from Ukraine have so much hatred towards
mhm,
Russia. So that's sad. And then it's also about wars. The next biggest possible war
mhm,
is going to be between the U.S. and China,
mm,
and I see the Chinese. They know what's happening around the world. The Chinese have been to the U.S. The Chinese have been to Australia, the
mhm,
UK, Europe, and all of that, and they understand both parts of the world.
mhm,
But then you look at the U.S. Uh, most people have never been to China, and they have so many misconceptions and fear and paranoia. So, uh, so I would say the traveling is one thing the world needs the most.
Yeah, I think that's a really good idea. When I talk with other world travelers like Cyrus Jansen, the idea of people to people exchanges, not government to government exchanges, but people traveling to other countries keeps coming up again and again and again as one of the best ideas of all the people I keep interviewing. So I would love to see more Americans come to China, come to India, come to Europe, travel around the world, get to see it for themselves, because I think a lot of the misconceptions that they here in media will be dispelled by just stepping off the plane. But you you talk about China a lot online, as I do. I was wondering, where have you been in China, and what did you think of the places that you have been?
Sure. Well, I had a lot of misconceptions about China. I thought it was a very poor country, a very dirty country, very boring country, that everybody is just working in factories. There's nothing else.
Mm,
So I went to China in 2019,
mm,
around the December time. So I went to Xi'an, Shanghai, and Beijing, and it just blew my mind away in like the first one day. You know,
mm,
like wow, this is so modern, so high tech, so clean, safe, well organized, and things get done so fast and efficient. And it was like a beautiful blend of modernity and history.
mm.
And so I thought it was like like you took London and you took Rome and you mix those two cities and you get Beijing. You know,
Wow.
and
That's
yeah. So I mean, I got to Xi'an very late at night, and
mhm,
then I woke up around 6 a.m. and I was staying at this Sheraton, I believe, which is I mean, which has the perfect location in the whole of Xi'an on
Mm,
that big plaza that's like
mm,
maybe 1 mile long.
mm.
So I just walked over to the plaza. The first thing I noticed was it was so clean. It was a huge plaza, massive, massive plaza, but it was so impeccable. I mean,
Mm.
you could have had like an omelet on the plaza. There was like no piece of paper, no can, not even like a leaf, and and it was pretty much the experience throughout my journey. You know, it's very with clean streets, very with clean parks, sidewalks, buildings. Everything is so clean, and that's something I really appreciated.
Mm,
And then just the high tech. You know,
mm,
I flew to Shanghai after. In Xi'an, I went to all the museums. You know,
mhm,
and there's so much history in China, right? And it
mm,
just blew my mind away. I mean, you go to the museums, you see, you know, they're like, oh, and this is something from 2000 BC,
mm,
4000 BC, and you look at the technology. You know, 4000 BC technology was just amazing. I'm
mm,
like, man, I cannot believe they did this like, 5,000, 6,000 years ago,
mm.
because I could not do this in 2023 on my own.
Sure, yeah. That's
Uh,
interesting. That's an interesting point. Yeah, I love the museum. What I find interesting, I'm not sure what in museums are like in India, but in the United States, museums are empty. Like there are very few people there. But I go to museums and they're like stuffed with people. I'm always surprised at how many Chinese people are interested in history, how popular going to museums is.
yes, well, you stole my point. That was my the next thing I was going to say. I was so surprised, how so many people, and especially the young people,
Mm,
because if you find like a 40, 50-year-old person, you can say, okay, I
yeah.
yes, I understand they like history. But these are like, small kids, 10, 12, and they have so much curiosity and
Mhm,
they talk so much about each the artifact. I was like, wow, China has a bright future. They have such
mm,
good kids. And some kids like in Xi'an,
mhm,
but kids who are like 15, 16, they travel in groups. And when they see me, they would just walk up to me and they would be like, hi, where are you from? We want to practice uh, I mean, English. And we would talk for like 15, 20 minutes. And they would ask very smart questions. They would
mm.
be like, "What do you like about China? What do you not like about China?" Very smart kids.
Mm.
Uh,
One of the things that I notice in the media a lot, we discuss this a lot online, is most Western media publications say very negative things about China's economy specifically. But also, there are a lot of politicians in the US who love to talk about how amazing the US economy is. Specifically, Yellen recently called America the winner of GDP growth in 2023. So I was wondering, how do you see China's economic prospects?
as I'm very bullish on China,
Hmm.
so because okay, so first of all, the Western media and politicians and the establishment, they have been underestimating China for the last, I mean, at least 25 years. You
Mm,
go back and read the great think tankers like Gerald Siegel from 1998, and yeah, and he goes, "What is China? China is nothing. It's just a mid-power. It has no GDP. It has no trade, no technology, no diplomatic power. They don't have a future. They might be like a regional power, but no way they're going to become a global power. And then you fast forward now, is just mind blowing what they've done.
Mm,
And they have a real economy. It's based on the industrial production.
mm,
And this is how the US was in the late 19th century. This is
mhm,
how Germany was in the late 19th century. And this is the secret sauce. Like if you go read the US history, they built the railways, you know,
mhm.
and they had real manufacturing. And the US actually, they stole a lot of patents from England and
Yeah,
all of
absolutely. Yeah.
because they knew people like uh, uh, Hamilton,
Hmm.
they fully understood the need for a solid economy based on production,
Hmm.
and that's what China is doing. And China has constantly climbed up the value chain in manufacturing. So many people on social media, they still talk about slave labor in China. I'm like, man, come on. Have you seen like the factories, the bite factories, and all of that in China? It's all like huge robots,
Hmm.
making bing, 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 and like the Maidea. I mean, is that the right way to say it?
I'm not
Maidea.
actually sure. Maybe.
So they are one of the largest. The household appliance
Mm,
manufacturers in China. So there was a video that I posted on Twitter, and they make like 15 washing machines. Oh,
mm.
sorry, one washing machine per 15 seconds.
Wow.
Yeah. So, and China plans so much in advance.
Mhm,
They plan 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. And these are very smart people,
mhm,
right? They all have PhDs in engineering and all of that. And they don't have to please the masses. Xi Jinping doesn't have to have slogans, like every 6 months. He doesn't have to play the divide and rule in China. They want actually the country to be united,
mhm,
so they want the one China, one focus, and you have the government, the corporations, and the people. They all look at in the same direction. They row the boats in the same direction.
mhm, mhm,
And so, like, if I may, so people may say, "Oh, but China has slowed down." You know, so last year China's GDP growth was 5.2%.
mhm,
So that is so much bigger than the G7 economies. You know,
mhm, mhm,
but China's economy could easily have been 7.5%, you know. And the reason that it was only 5.2% is that you have to see what has happened in the last 5 years.
mhm,
So the US has started off with the tariffs,
mhm,
the trade tariffs. So Trump imposed 25% tariffs on all Chinese goods coming to the US. That had a huge impact. And then, worse than the tariffs are the sanctions. You know, the U.S. has placed 1,000 Chinese companies and the
mhm,
institution under U.S. sanctions. So, but it means China cannot sell products to the U.S. China cannot buy the components, software, hardware from the U.S. And worse, what happens with the U.S. sanctions is that all of the allies, they have to obey the U.S. sanctions, right? So
mhm,
when the U.S. First placed sanctions on Huawei, Huawei said, okay, no problem. We will sell our 5G, the infrastructure to the rest of the world. Then people like Trump's Secretary of State, what is his name? I forgot. The CIA director.
Yeah.
Oh, Mike Pompeo.
Hmm.
So he traveled all over Europe, and he
Hmm.
forced the Europeans to not to buy Huawei,
Hmm.
and then to rip off the existing Huawei. Such, I mean, like these are all blatant violations of free trade, WTO rules. Like you cannot just pick on one nation.
Hmm.
That's against all the rules. And then Huawei said, okay, fine, we cannot sell to Europe and to US, and we will sell to the rest of the world, and we'll make our own chips. And then what did the US do? They went to Netherlands, and they went to the TSMC and Samsung, and they said, don't make chips for Huawei. So
Hmm.
then they had to obey the US sanctions, and they could not make the chips for Huawei. So then Huawei said, okay, fine. So I cannot sell you guys chips, and you won't make me chips. Let me make my own chips, right? So the
Yeah.
right. So then they said, okay, we will buy the semiconductor manufacturing equipment from the Netherlands, uh, the ASML, and then we'll make our own chips. And guess what happened? The US
Yeah.
banned the Netherlands from selling the equipment that make the chips. So, like all sorts of these sanctions are the reason why China's economy is only 5.2%.
Hmm.
Because if you didn't, like if you followed the true principles of free trade, then China would still be growing at like maybe 9%, you know,
Hmm.
uh, because but think of how many smartphones that, a Xiaomi would be able to sell in the US. I
Hmm.
think how many Huawei, Midea, the Hikvision, all sorts of companies would have a huge market in the US. And, I mean, the cars, right? I mean, but Tesla, so Musk, he said a few days ago, we need more trade barriers on the Chinese cars
Hmm.
because else they will just crush all the competition in the US. And that was so pathetic because but Tesla can build in China
Hmm.
and they can sell cars in China.
Hmm.
And in fact, they sell pretty much almost as many cars in China as they do in the US.
Hmm.
So last year, Tesla sold like 600,000 Tesla cars in China, you know?
I see them everywhere here in
Yeah.
Base. Yeah.
So why doesn't he say, hey, let buy, build factories in the US
Mm.
and sell cars in the US?
Mm.
And that would be or think of like Wuling, the little tiny car for
Yeah.
five,
Yeah.
$6,000. That would be so helpful
Mm.
to so many Americans. There are a lot of working class Americans who would
Mm.
really benefit from having a car that's like maybe $6,000, $7,000.
Yeah. Well, Tata was supposed to do that. India's Tata was trying to do that 10 years ago, make tiny cars for, a different part of the, income scale, but it didn't take off. Let's switch up a little bit and talk about diplomacy, because in order for things to move forward, we need everyone to get along. And I would say a couple of years ago, maybe a year and a half ago, we were at a low point between the U.S. and China. And obviously, the U.S. diplomacy with China, as you've pointed out, affects dozens of other countries that are basically forced to listen to the U.S. But we had visits by Blinken, Yellen, Governor Newsom, And we had President Xi visit to San Francisco, Wang Yi's visit to Washington, D.C. And before that, we had Tim Cook, Elon Musk, and others coming to China. Where do you see better prospects for increased diplomacy between the U.S. and China?
Yeah, so this is going to be very tough, Jason, because it's just that, there is one rising power and there is a status quo power. And if you look at the history of the world,
Mm.
there has been pretty much almost, no situation where the status quo power said, okay, you win, I will just hand over, the crown to you.
May I interrupt? Because I've heard that argument from the professor at Harvard who talks about, what is it, Thucydides trap, or however it's pronounced.
Yeah.
But my feeling is that it did happen at least one time, because as the British Empire was falling, the Brits kind of tied their boats to the U.S., and then the U.S. rose, and England kind of just stayed stuck to the side of it. And that did work out. So I'm hopeful that maybe the United States could say, hey, maybe we are losing some of our economic power, and maybe we should be tying our boats to China. That's my dream. That's my dream anyway.
Yeah. So the one, yes, that's a good point. But the difference is that Britain and the U.S., they share the same language, the culture, and they feel like brothers. You know.
Mm-hmm.
So and what happened was they kind of like merged. I mean, it was like the mergers and acquisition. So the U.S., the empire, they just slowly took over the British Empire, and then the CIA and the MI6, they kind of merged, and you have the Five Eyes, right? So from the elite's point of view, the intelligence point of view, it was a very peaceful merger. And they have the same banking, the aristocracy, the corporations. So I think that was like I don't see that happening with the U.S. and China, because fundamentally they are very different systems, right? In the U.S., who rules the U.S.? It's the corporations,
Mm-hmm.
right? They control all the politicians. They have the lobbying power. They control the media. The media can destroy the politician. The military, the industrial complex is basically one big of a corporation. Right? But in China, it's the opposite. It's
Mm-hmm.
the government that sits above the corporation. So the government says, well, listen, hey guys, we're not here just to make money. Okay, so we are here to prosper as a nation. We have to take care of 1.4 billion people. We have a vision for the country, you know. So, like, if you look at the banking statement, this is like the perfect example. So you take a look at, say, the annual shareholders, the newsletter, or whatever they call it, of JP Morgan versus, say, Bank of China.
Mm-hmm.
So JP Morgan will be like, we gave $15 billion back to our shareholders in the form of stock buybacks and dividends. And our stock price went up by 30% last year. But even though the GDP grew only like 1%.
Mm-hmm.
And then you look at the statements from Bank of China, it's very different. They're like, we spent $40 billion on rural development. We spent, $70 billion on poverty alleviation. We gave so many loans to the manufacturing sector. It's like a very, very different philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, I mean, so theoretically, yes, I would like the U.S. and China to sit down and
Mm,
create a new framework for the world. You
mm,
know, a new security framework, a new economic framework, and there's a lot for the U.S. to benefit from as well. Because
mm,
right now, the U.S. is just wasting money on
mm,
war, just endless, perpetual wars. It's really bad for the U.S., it's really
mm,
bad for Americans, and it can sit with China and create a new peaceful century for
mhm.
the 21st century, you know? So the US
Absolutely.
should join the Belt and Road Initiative, and maybe China should come to the US and build all the bridges, the highways, the
Well, I mean,
airport.
the New Bay Bridge in San Francisco, in fact, was built by China and then sent to the United States and erected there. So, I think the United States, a lot of its largest bridge projects, in fact, do come from China already. I want to switch gears again because it's rare I have someone from India here. So, Sino-Indian relations are another sensitive area, and India is a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the BRICS, not BRI, and not the RCEP, the trade zone, which includes Australia, which is unusual. But I'm really happy that Australia and China are in the same trade bloc. India also seems to be courting stronger military ties with the U.S. simultaneously, so the relationship is extremely complex and it's difficult to understand outside of India what's actually going on. So I'm curious, what do you see are prospects for deepening cooperation between India and China?
Yeah, that's again a big question, and it's very complex.
Hmm.
So I hope that India and China would figure out a way to coexist, you know. And it's kind of sad because if you look at the last 2,000 years, then these two civilizations had very good relations, you know.
Hmm.
But 2,000 years ago, the Chinese boats would come all the way to the southern tip of India, and
Hmm.
they would drop off all their goods like silk, porcelain, tea, whatever. And then the Indian ships would take that to the Roman Empire. You know, so they would follow the monsoon winds. So
Hmm.
they would have these big sails, and it would just push the boats straight uh, to the African part of the area, and then there would be the camels that would take them across the what is now the Suez Canal, and
Hmm.
then from there it would go to Rome. So the Romans they would never knew how silk was made,
Hmm.
because they had so many the middlemen between
Hmm.
China and Italy. So they thought that silk actually it grew on the trees. So uh, so we had very good relations. When I went to Xi'an, I went to this Buddhist temple, and there
Hmm.
was this huge statue of a Buddha uh, made out of gold, and
Wow.
that was actually brought from India around 300 AD.
Wow.
So whenever I meet a Chinese person, I feel like we share the same values.
Mm.
We think the same, we act the same. We have very similar values about education, family, the culture, tradition, and all of that. And I can very easily relate to them. So from that point of view, we should be closer. But so you have the geopolitical tension. So there is the struggle with spheres of influence. So, well, India wants to be kind of the daddy of all this, small countries around, like
Mhm.
Nepal, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, Maldives, and so on. But it's very hard for those countries to be just one-sided. They have the right to have a strategic autonomy. Just like we have a strategic relations between both Russia as well as the U.S. because
Mhm.
we cannot afford uh, to become the enemy of Russia.
Mhm.
So uh, we tell Americans, hey, we have the right to have strategic autonomy. Okay, so don't try to force us into taking sides.
Mhm.
Okay, but then the same logic applies to all India's neighbors.
Mhm.
So there's no reason that Nepal should just be 100% pro-India and be
Mhm.
against China, because for one, from a very practical point of view, the Chinese have more money, okay, and they have more skill. If Nepal comes to India and says, "Hey guys, build a railway," we will take like about 10 years, and then China will do it in 1 year.
Mhm.
So there's no reason why they're going to be against China.
Mhm.
So I think that India should work out because China is a very wise country.
Mhm.
They have 5,000 years of the experience with the dynasties, and they fully understand geopolitics. So they don't want to force India. They don't want to start a fight with India with 1.4 billion people, and so they want to coexist. They want to resolve the issues,
Mhm.
and I think we'll be able to do it. Now, the problem, why we have a very hard time making peace with China is because of the U.S. You know,
Mhm. Mhm.
because if you look at all the Indian, the elites, whether it's the engineers or the economists, what did they do? They go to the U.S.
Mhm.
They go
Yeah,
study
that's right.
you know so for them the dream come true of the smartest person in India is to go study at Stanford, study at Harvard, and then their life is so blissful. So and then they go to the US, and of course they're gonna get all these the neoliberal training at but Stanford, Columbia, Yale, whatever, and they learn the wonders of financialization. And
Mhm.
then they come back and tell Indians, guys, forget about manufacturing. We need to focus on the stock market. Okay,
Mhm.
that's where the money is.
Mhm.
So if you look at China's stock market valuation, it's
Mhm.
like 1/3 of the GDP,
Mhm.
and for us, it's 100%. So it's
Mhm.
actually the stock market valuation in India is actually a bit larger than India's GDP.
Well,
You
can I
know,
ask I want to ask a question specifically about this because, 30 years ago, like you said, 25 years ago, people in the United States and the West, they underestimated China and they didn't think that it was capable of the feats that it has accomplished. And in a way, India jumped over manufacturing straight into advanced goods, software, a very advanced technical finance. But it is possible that India does develop out in the way that China has. No? What are your thoughts? Can India emulate some of China's successes in the coming decade or two?
I would say it's 50-50,
Mm,
because theoretically speaking, we have the demographic dividend. The median age is only like 28. So we have a lot of young people, and the wages are much cheaper than China, maybe like 1/4 or 1/5 of China. But but you have to see what China did 30 years ago. They started to move hundreds of millions of people from villages to the cities, the urbanization project, right? We are not doing that so well in India. We still have 900 million people living in the rural areas. So to move those people, you need to build cities, you need to build highways, you need to provide electricity. So, for example, if you look at the electricity production in India, it's 1/6 that of China. So very much the same ratio as the GDP.
Mhm.
So, so there's a lot of the infrastructure things that India needs to do, and we need to do it fast,
Mhm. Mhm.
because things happen at a very slow pace in India. So like for example, like last year, as you posted on Twitter, China's solar, the new capacity, the addition was about with 200 gigawatts.
Yeah.
Okay, 200. So guess what was it for India? It was about 7 gigawatts. 7 gigawatts.
Mm.
Okay, so 7 versus 200.
Mhm.
So that's the kind of scale and speed we need to learn from China.
Mm.
And the problem in India is a lot of people don't like any criticism, you know. So, like if I go on Twitter and I say, "Hey guys, we should do this, better. We should follow China," then I get attacked. You are a
Mm.
CCP agent.
Yeah, I have the same problem trying to convince Americans to build better infrastructure. I get the same attacks. Let's switch gears again. Um, what do you think is right or wrong with U.S. media coverage of China?
My God. So do we have? So do we have like an hour?
Sorry, we're gonna have only a few minutes, but maybe just the highlights.
So, I mean, first thing is they're just blind. You
Mm.
cannot be blind as a journalist. So you have to see the truth objectively. You
Mm.
cannot be like Senator with Tom Cotton.
Yeah,
So,
cotton.
like,
Oh.
you know, yeah. So, like, if you read the New York Times,
Mm.
it should give like an objective perspective. Oh, so these are all the good things about China. These are all the bad things about China. And these are the strengths and these are the weaknesses. You
Mm.
know, but instead, what happens is it's just like nonsensical propaganda.
Mm.
They have journalists who don't speak a word of Chinese, who probably have never been to China, and they choose people who don't like China. You know,
Yeah, it does look
so,
like that. Yes.
yeah, and sometimes they would choose these Chinese people from Taiwan, and then they come with like a whole bunch of psychological baggage,
Mm.
so they cannot see anything good.
Mm.
And so it's really, they're doing something very bad for the U.S.
Mhm. Mhm.
Because this is the whole reason that the U.S. missed out on China's rise,
Mhm.
and this is the whole reason that the U.S. Outsourced the high-tech manufacturing to China. You know, so like if the U.S. were smart, they would have just stuck to shoes and shirts. Uh, I mean, that would have been the Machiavellian thing to do. You know,
Mhm.
uh, so like they should have totally protected the high-end manufacturing. But instead, so now, like what happens is the CEO of Raytheon, he came and he gave like an interview, and he said the Raytheon's missiles and whatnot,
Mm.
they depend on thousands of Chinese suppliers.
Mm.
So that's a strategic blunder for the U.S. As how can the U.S. go to war with China
Well,
when
that
all.
gives me hope, actually, that the U.S. has failed to protect its logistics and supply chain to the point where maybe conflict between China and the United States is not possible. So that's kind of like a good outcome if you look at it from another angle.
That's true. That's true. Yeah.
What do you think the addition? So Xi Jinping, when he was in San Francisco, he proposed 50,000 U.S. students. He didn't specify college students, so maybe it's high school and college. I'm not sure. 50,000 U.S. students come to China to study. I think this is a fantastic idea, and I wish that this would happen because maybe America would learn a lot more about China to all kinds of advantage. What do you think that this potentially could do for Sino-U.S. relations?
Wow. I mean, maybe this is the best thing that could happen for the world. You know, just imagine 50,000 people going to China and they see, oh my God, this is like amazing. I love the streets. I love the subways. We are so behind in America. And I don't see the homeless tents and beggars and drug addicts on the street. And I don't see protests and polarization.
Mm,
People are just happy as one country. They have good values. It's a stable, safe society, and the women could be walking around Shanghai and Beijing at midnight with no fear. So and then that would make them ask, why don't we have this in America? You know,
mm,
and
mm,
uh, and they could be the bridge between the two
mhm,
countries. You know,
mm.
because a lot of the times, if you like one person, then you like the whole country, for like a lot of
Yeah, that's
people.
true. I was
Yeah.
talking to someone recently from England. He said he didn't have a very positive opinion about China his whole life until 2019, and he met a Chinese lady in Manchester, and then she told him what she thought of China, and he was like, "Oh wow, China's not bad after all." So yeah, one person can make a massive difference. So those 50,000 students, imagine most of them return home. So 40, 45, 49,000, whatever, go back to the United States and have very positive stories to tell about their experience in China. I think that would be great. And I agree with you completely. I really think a lot of Americans, we can learn about how to improve our own society by looking at example, not just China. I'm not trying to say China is like the perfect country, but Americans, like you said at the beginning of the show, could travel around the world and take like the best pieces of different things to try to improve our own society. But our media tells us America's number one. America, go. So like we don't end up learning from other countries, and our media misrepresent not just China, but a lot of nations, a lot of cultures around the world. And so the consequence, the outcome of that is we don't improve because we think we're already the best. Next question. Before Blinken came, before Gavin Newsom came, before Yellen came, before Wang Yi went to Washington, D.C., we had Tim Cook, we had Elon Musk, we had, massive titans of U.S. industry come to China and meet publicly with leadership in China, with the central government in China, and it looked like they were kind of paving the way for the normalization of Sino-U.S. relations. What do you think that companies like Apple and Yum Brands and Tesla, why are they pouring trillions of dollars into China? If senators like Tom Cotton are saying China is bad, don't you shouldn't even talk to what was the CEO of TikTok, Chu. You shouldn't even be talking to people in China. Like, how do you know people in China? Do you like Chinese food? It was awful. So like, why is it that there are leaders saying, beware of China, and in the meantime, titans of industry are running into China as fast as they can?
Yeah, it's a very love-hate relationship between the US and China. So if you read the media, it's like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, China is gonna collapse, and then
Mm.
Thursday, Friday, Saturday, China is gonna take over the world. Like,
Yeah.
guys, make up your mind. What this is. So, so you know, uh, so like if you like go back to the 19th century, Rockefeller, he fully understood the Chinese market.
Mm.
So he gave away the kerosene lamps in China. And this was the first freemium model in the world because he's like, okay, so I'm going to give hundreds of thousands of free kerosene lamps to the Chinese.
Hmm.
And I will give the first free bottle of the kerosene. And once they get used to the wonders of the lamp, and then they're going to buy more oil from Rockefeller.
Hmm.
So since those times, oh, and also that Rockefeller's grandson, he came with Nixon in 1972 to
Wow.
China. And so he was the chairman of the Chase Manhattan Bank.
Hmm.
So the corporate world of China, they fully understand the value of the Chinese market, the Chinese workers. But here is the twist: they are also a little bit afraid of the Chinese,
Hmm.
right? So they want the perfect Chinese, who are rich enough to buy Tesla, but
Hmm.
not smart enough to compete with Tesla.
Hmm.
They want the Chinese to be rich enough to buy an iPhone, but not smart enough to make Xiaomi, and so on.
Yeah.
So
Hmm.
that's the struggle or the dilemma that they face. But I say that the U.S. is a very, or at least was a very smart country. You know, so if you look at, the history of the U.S. in uh, the 19th century and in the first half of the 20th century, like you see how people were so innovative and so creative and so bold and daring, whether
Hmm.
it's the Wright brothers or Henry Ford or Thomas Edison. And the US, they invented cell phones, the internet, GPS, semiconductor chips, blah, blah, blah,
Uh-huh.
So what happened to that US? You
Hmm.
know, that US is kind of gone, So now they're so insecure, so paranoia. Oh, please save me from the Chinese products. Come on, you know, make better products,
Yeah, make the new thing. Yeah, exactly. Our last question. De-dollarization is something that gets thrown around a lot lately, and different people say very, very different things about what they think it is, what they think it will do, when they think it will happen. What are your thoughts on de-dollarization?
Yeah, that has already started to happen, and it got accelerated when the U.S. and the EU placed sanctions on Russia, and
Mm.
they stole like $300 billion of Russia's foreign exchange,
Hmm.
and just totally illegal. And
Hmm.
now the rest of the world is thinking, well, hold on, so I have billions and billions of dollars in the U.S. banks. So
Hmm.
for example, like if you take my country, India, we have $300 billion of the foreign exchange in the U.S. dollars and U.S. treasuries. You
Hmm.
know, and where do we keep it? We don't keep it in the Indian banks. We keep them in the American banks.
Mm.
So we could wake up tomorrow, and the U.S. could just seize all of that.
Hmm.
This is why BRICS is doing a de-dollarization. And if you
Mm.
look at Russia-China trade, it's now 95% of the Russia-China trade is happening in yuan and rubles.
Mm.
And the Russians in China, the Russians living in Russia, they can go to a bank and they can open up an account in Chinese yuan.
Hmm.
So the internationalization of yuan is rapidly accelerating. And if you look at China's trade, more than half of that is actually happening in yuan.
Mm.
So the US should wake up and it should prepare for the world beyond the US dollar.
That's a really good way of putting it. Thank you so much for your time. You are really insightful and amazing person. I'm glad that I'm following you on X. We can find you at what is your handle on X?
It's Kanthan 2030.
Right.
About
Look
two.
for Kanthan 2030 on X, and you won't be disappointed. His analysis is amazing. I look at everything you post. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your time, listeners.
Thank you so much, Jason. I really enjoyed it.
Hello.